Shock Piece: The Search for Freedom. A novel by C. Nguyen. Chapter 7: The Theory. Nguyen, Mac, and Dien had many small talks in the following months, and their discussion always revolved around the frustration of how the South had failed. "I guess it's because we were so naive," Mac said quietly. "Yeah, to fall for their wicked manipulation, the Southerners were naive. But don't you see, Mac? To many Southerners, the frustration of defending their border was enough to tire them of the war. At heart, we are a peaceful and fun-loving people, gentle and simple. Do you agree? We are gullible and straightforward, especially farmers and peasants," Nguyen continued without waiting for Mac to reply. "And remember, the majority of the southern population are farmers and peasants. Their fertile land and extensive, intricate system of rivers and dams easily provided plenty of rice and freshwater fish and prawns for the whole country in the past and even in wartime. Don't you forget that Vietnam was a leading exporter of rice to other Southeast Asian countries in the 60s and 70s. The complication of politics and power struggles was not in their interest, and most of the time they left it to the people of the North or Central regions. They are content with their lifestyle, Mac. Okay, now tell me, why were many guerrillas among the peasants led by a handful of thoroughly trained communists? Because the communists insinuated hostility and resentment into the peasants' unsophisticated minds, along with the concept of anti-landlordism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Americanism. They led them into believing the fight was for equal rights and freedom from foreign oppression," Dien quickly replied, eager to voice his opinion. "I can't put it any other way, son. I thought the same, father. The majority of the southern peasants had limited education. And unfortunately," Mac chuckled at his choice of words, Some literate ones were given freedom of choice, albeit partially. Nevertheless, they still had some freedom of speech and exerted their influence on others. However, they didn't understand the sophisticated information given to them, or it was not explained, so it was easily confused by the misinterpretation of communist infiltrators. They thought they would have equal rights and share wealth if they were living in the communist system. Pity how wrong they were." Mac reached up to fill the cup with more hot tea for his father-in-law, shaking his head sorrowfully. "How naive." Nguyen replied, "And with skillful propaganda, the communists formed resistant guerrilla units scattered throughout the length of Vietnam that brought havoc and vexation to the Americans and South Vietnamese army in terrorist combat. The horror and dread of not knowing who were friends or foes in the guerrilla war were enough to demoralize many of the U.S. GIs. He picked up the dainty cup of tea, slowly inhaling its vapor. He then carefully sipped a few small gulps, enjoying its faint jasmine fragrance, before putting the china gently back onto its saucer. Nguyen was savoring the few last pleasures in this transitional period of life. He was not sure if sipping tea in his ceremonial tradition would be considered outlandishly arrogant in the world of the communists. He might be forced to abandon his enjoyment sooner. It was too grand for their liking, Nguyen thought. The Americans got involved out of the kindness of their hearts, but they put their people into our war needlessly. Don't you think so, father? Mac questioned his father-in-law again, jolting Nguyen out of his reverie. "I'm not quite sure, Mac. Nevertheless, I'm inclined to agree with you that they should have only provided help and advice without actually sending their troops onto our land. Their presence gave the Vietnamese communists a strong motivation for their war. The noble thrust of patriotism in people's hearts to throw the Americans off their land and regain independence. They won because of that too, I think, Nguyen said sadly. Mac followed quietly. I know they meant well, and they helped us tremendously. We cannot thank them enough, but American involvement had an adverse effect on our morale as well. Don't you think so? The entire population of the North was fed a noble and unique goal: liberate South Vietnam from the oppression of the Americans and reunify the country. On one side, the South's sole purpose was to defend the homeland, and on the other side was to attack, to take over. The Northerners were fed limited, distorted news or biased truth and were totally ignorant of the outside world for the entire duration of the Civil War. Ho Chi Minh and his Communist Party were successful in misleading their people and exerting a powerful determination to liberate South Vietnam and reunify the country. Mac went on without waiting for anyone's response. That was stressed resolutely by the name chosen for their army, the National Liberation Front, which included many patriots from the South who had volunteered to follow Ho Chi Minh to the North after the anti-French Revolution and the Geneva Agreement in 1954. We were poorly led. Our leaders didn't choose politics as skillfully as they did. We should have had some goal. Don't you think if the South had initiated the advance toward the North and put forward the great cause of liberating the people from communism, then perhaps we would have had a greater chance of winning? Dien was agitated. He thought of his fellow soldiers who fought bravely for nothing. I often wondered the same. It was a pity the South did not use that possibility. They were content and prosperous in their own land. Perhaps their selfishness prevented them from thinking that, as they might have had to share their wealth with the North once it had become their responsibility. Nguyen smiled. And now the South has been stripped bare from their invasion anyhow. So much for thinking of having to take care of them. Now they're taking everything away from us. Mac was more agitated. Father agreed. Yes, I know. Our fertile land and high standard of living might have failed us in this war. We didn't see the need to fight. However, it was the opposite for the North. Their standard of living was always poorer. They never had a staple diet from their own food supply, but relied heavily on the South in the undivided country of the past. Ho Chi Minh and his party members relentlessly pushed forward solely for the profitable gain they were going to reap once they got hold of the South. I'm sure of it now. On the pretext of a noble mission, the Vietnamese Communist Party led the whole nation into ghastly, prolonged bloodshed and the transformation of the North into a poor, undeveloped, and backward country. Everything seemed to stop growing or flourishing since his leadership began in 1954. Mac added, then because of the guerrilla fighting and the demoralization of the GIs, the anti-war activists used this extensively and artfully in their campaigns. Obviously, they had won over the confidence of a small proportion of the South population, the U.S. citizens and congressmen, as well as the rest of the world over the prolonged period of fighting. Thus, the cry for peace was louder than the real threat of communism, and so they had to give up. The troops had to leave us without help and support, Dien concluded. So the more pity for us, no help from them anymore, Nguyen repeated regretfully. Their discussions went on, but that did not change the fact that the South had failed through their general indifference. You see, even our own people were divided and fighting proudly for the opposite side as guerrillas. The peasants during daytime turned guerrillas at night were a nightmare for everyone, especially the armed forces and citizens. Besides, the peace-loving attitude of the Republican Southerners prevented them from seeing the war as a goal they had to win, but only trying to defend themselves whenever they had to, Nguyen admitted sorrowfully. Even with strong, courageous armed forces and personnel, without a noble cause and a goal, then the fighting spirit would fade with time. Unfortunately, that time factor was very much the challenge at the core. Eventually, it eroded the willingness of the defending side to retaliate. People got tired of the war after so many years of bloodshed and misery. Between the attackers and the defenders, the seesaw was always inclining to one side, and the latter was always at the weaker end. Mac agreed. Even the Americans were beaten by the time factor. They could not finish off the war as quickly as they planned to. Their aggressive tactic in warfare was to conclude the conflict between the two sides in the shortest time possible. It didn't happen, did it? Yeah, it's a pity. It went on longer than necessary. In the end, they were tired of it too. That led to the abandonment of their assistance after more than a decade of costly military aid. The high number of US casualties in Vietnam War was also a sad fact in their futile attempt. The high number of US casualties in the Vietnam War was also a sad fact in their futile attempt. Would you believe there were 58,000 casualties in total? No wonder the protest for peace was much louder than for war. I can't blame them, Nguyen concluded. Our number of ARVN casualties was shocking too, Father. 260,000 in all. Dien shook his head. Sadly, war is always a big loss. Their discussions did not change the fact that for years after the fall of Saigon, South Vietnam and its citizens suffered incredibly barbaric treatment. The hatred and animosity from the communists were only understood belatedly by the Southerners. After a short initial recuperation period, the Vietnamese Communist Party began their revenge and punishment of the Republic of South Vietnam. We're the second-class citizens. The Southerners were aghast at how the new state government considered their status even in peace. They only wanted to inflict revenge and punishment on us, as if the Southerners had to pay for the damage and suffering of the relentless 21-year civil war waged by themselves, those northern communists. Yes, those bastards. There's no government to revive and reunify the nation but a band of profiteers and robbers who come to take away what they think they are freely entitled to seize, the reward of the conquerors. A bunch of liars and hypocrites, filthy communists, bloody savages. How could they be so cruel to their own blood? They still think of us Southerners as their enemies. We're not their own blood, mate. Yeah, you're right. They can't get over the animosity feeling toward us, and they're treating us with the vengeance of the conquerors. Not brothers reunited with brothers, I'm afraid. What good to come with peace and unity but shattered dreams? Part of it was our own fault. We should have been more diligent in fighting them. Those were the frustrated whispers among the Southerners following much mistreatment dealt out to them in the subsequent days. It was an appalling experience for the people of South Vietnam after the war ended that they had felt the shock peace hitting right at them, and that eventually led to the ghastly exodus of approximately more than 1 million people by sea in search of freedom.